Hello. So I want to talk about communism a little bit. The question is, does it work? Can it work? And is it worth trying? Um, and so the common consensus, I think, in the West especially, is no, it doesn't work. And you point to the examples of every time that anybody's tried to implement it in the 20th century, especially, and that they've all been catastrophic failures. And this is taken as evidence that it doesn't work. And so the people who defend communism then, or defend Marxism, while conceding that these examples didn't work, will say a sort of variation of the argument that these were not true forms of communism or that they didn't implement it correctly, and that had they only implemented it correctly, it might have been successful. And so a lot of people don't like this form of argument. It almost sounds like a sort of no true Scotsman fallacy type of thing. Well, if it were real communism, it would have worked. And I have a similar sort of distaste for that sort of cop out, especially when you point to the failures of modern capitalism in the West. The extreme proponents of laissez-faire market systems will say, "Oh, yeah, but that's not capitalism. It's corporatism, or it's something else. This, that, and the third." Nobody ever wants to own up to the results of their system, the pragmatic results of their system in action, and and so that does get annoying. So I would just point out, just as a devil's advocate argument, that two things in regard to communism. One, that every instance in which communism they tried to implement it, all these failures, they weren't. It's not like there was a wide variety of different contexts in which communism was attempted to be implemented. They shared a lot of things in common. These different societies and these different regimes. In almost every single circumstance, there was extreme political chaos prior to a communist regime taking the reins of power. In essence, there was basically a power vacuum uh, that was left over by the existing order being overthrown or falling apart. And also, in every single circumstance, it would seem, especially most notably in Russia and in China, the two really big enterprises in terms of trying to make a communist power. Both of these societies were largely agrarian and not industrialized. And it is important to point out that Marx, when he spoke about communism, spoke about it as something that was going to come about as a sort of inevitable result of industrialization and technology. That was essentially how it was envisioned. It was envisioned as a consequence of an industrialized workforce that was going to become efficient enough to implement this sort of communist utopia that he spoke of. And so the Russians and the Chinese did not have this infrastructure in place, but they had ideologues that wanted those countries to go in the direction of communism. And so they essentially forced uh, those countries into a rapid industrialization at the cost of starving millions of people. And so this is Stalin's 5 year plan, and Mao's various efforts. At first, they tried to do communal farming and make communism work as an agrarian system, which it was never designed to do, and obviously failed. And then eventually, China, gave in and started competing in the global markets. And now they're not even really communist anymore. Nominally speaking, they're communist. They consider themselves communist because the regime was never overthrown, and they're still ideologues in that sense, but they participate in global capitalism, in global trade. That's their bread and butter. They wouldn't be able to exist as a society without it. So they're not exactly the same kind of communism that we dealt with Russia, where we were actually dealing with two competing economic systems: one, global capitalism on the one hand, and then the Soviet insular planned economy on the other. China gave up on those efforts, but also in Russia, just going back to the 5 year plan, um, essentially they did punish the kulaks. I was listening to Jordan Peterson speak about this. They did essentially go in and uh, persecute people for being successful peasants and successful farmers, and they sent them off to Siberia, and that was a war crime, and all this, that, and the third. But also on top of that, they didn't just get rid of all the capable farmers, because they were still perfectly capable of growing crops in Russia. The problem was they seized control of all of the assets of all the crops, and so they said uh, this is property of the state now. And so then they exported those crops instead of using them to feed their population, because they wanted to use that money from the exporting in order to industrialize Russia and build up their armaments. And so it's interesting to think about, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting to think about how things might have played out differently had Stalin not implemented the 5 year plan. Like, imagine World War II. How might that have implemented differently had Stalin not? How might that have unfolded differently had Stalin not implemented the 5 year plan? It's hard to imagine. Could the Nazis maybe have marched in and taken Russia? I don't think it's unforeseeable that they could have possibly been the winners in World War II had different circumstances not played out differently. I think it was, you know, at least a possibility that it was a winnable war for the Nazis. So I don't know. Not that any of that justifies the 5 year plan. Obviously, they didn't implement it to defeat the Nazis. But what if it was a key aspect in us, the Allies, ultimately being able to defeat the Nazis? That's an interesting sort of dilemma, because it's something. It's another example where we benefit from something that was utterly callous and immoral, and it makes us nervous. But like I said, that's a tangent. Uh, so the one other thing I would say about communism, just as a devil's advocate sort of argument, is that it does work, and demonstrably so, in lower life forms, in ants and in bees. It's pretty easy to paint these colonies as taking on a sort of collectivist or communist structure. Obviously, they're not politicized, so you don't want to, you know, it's sort of an analogy, but I think it's a pretty coherent and strong analogy, because a lot of people have the misconception that ants or bees have like a queen, that then there's a hierarchical structure like we picture in a human society, a hierarchical structure where the workers and the soldiers and all these other ants are issued orders, based on this hierarchy, and that, the queen is running things. And ultimately, that's not really true. What happens is there's a form of essentially collective intelligence, collective swarm intelligence, what they call it. And each individual ant acts on a series of very simple rules. Um, and they communicate with each other based on pheromones and based on sounds and other shit. And essentially, collectively, the colony is capable of making extremely complex decisions, such as where's a suitable nest site, where do we forage for food, who's going to be the next queen, this, that, and the third. They're capable of making incredibly complex decisions as a society for the good of the society, while the individual is essentially expendable. And the individual will not assert its own rights and its own well-being at the detriment of the society. All individuals are working towards the benefit of the colony. And why does this work? The fundamental question of why does this work in ant colonies and bee colonies so well? And the answer is essentially that genetically they're designed to work that way, because the queen passes on her genes, and everybody is working towards the aim of the queen passing on its genes. Essentially, the colony acts as a sort of organism, even though it's a collection of organisms. Evolutionarily, it acts almost as one organism, because collectively they work to pass on the genes of the queen to the next colony. The individual ants do not reproduce, and so the evolutionary logic is flipped on its head, that usually we deal with, where each individual organism is a carrier of its genes that wants to pass on its genes to the next generation. This just simply isn't true in ant colonies and bee colonies, and this is why they take on this sort of collective uh, structure. And so the interesting thing about this is how incredibly potent and sort of uh, I'm, I'm trying to think of a good word, but like how they're able to persevere through incredibly uh, harsh environments, incredibly different problems that they have to face, and like it's very difficult to destroy ant colonies and things like that because they have all these structures where they cope and they adapt and they persevere against even the most perilous threats in many cases. And a lot of this comes down, I think, to their collective structure. And so, because they're engineered this way, it works so incredibly well for them. Now, you might say, "Well, this is a fine analogy, and fine. If you wanna talk about insects, maybe communism works, but we still don't have any evidence that it works with humans." That's a fair enough point, and perhaps it can't because of the way that humans are structured biologically and the way that we each are going to have our own individual aims and our own individual ambitions, and that might come into conflict with the state or the colony. It's possible that it can't be implemented properly in a human society. I'm not saying that's definitely true, but that is a possibility. I can't rule it out. But I would point out, just for the sake of argument, that the only times we've ever seen it try to be implemented in a human society is as a form of extreme desperation. Uh, in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, Venezuela, in every single circumstance. It's never come about in an extremely prosperous and well functioning society as a aim to sort of fulfill some higher goal. And so they make these sacrifices and try to become communist because they feel they're ready to do so. It almost always has come about, uh, like I say, in this power vacuum where this incredibly sort of dystopian type of structure might come out to manifest in the chaos. And you can almost draw a parallel between this and the fascists in a sense, because they also treated their people in a similar way where the individual was ultimately expendable, and the state was the most important thing to everybody. And you can also draw a parallel of this to, let's say, ISIS, the Islamic State. Now, I'm conflating a few things here because obviously it's not, these aren't all based on the same doctrine of Marxism, which is how people typically define communism. But just in terms of the collectivist structure where the individual is expendable and the state is the everybody needs to be more loyal to the state than to their own life. You can see this sort of thing in ISIS or in these terrorist groups where people are willing to literally blow themselves up for the cause if it's going to hurt the enemy enough. Or in the kamikaze pilots in Japan who did a similar thing, or the people in Japan who were willing to fight till the very end. They had to be ordered down after the nuclear bombs struck. And so, it can manifest in a number of ways in human societies. But it can be an incredibly potent structure for creating an entity which is capable of acting on behalf of its own wants and needs, and each individual member of that entity has to essentially sacrifice some of their own autonomy to the greater good of that entity. And we've seen that it's been sort of catastrophic in every totalitarian aspect, every example of a totalitarian regime that's tried to implement it in recent history. Now, these are, to be fair, these are a very limited number of examples, and so like, I would point out, like, you could make similarly cynical statements about democracy, for instance, if you were to look at the example of the Weimar Republic and or the example of the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they tried to have democracy in Russia, where in these contexts where there wasn't a strong tradition of democracy already in place, embedded in those cultures, ultimately democracy failed to flourish. Or in Iraq, after we left, democracy once again failed to flourish. And so you can make similarly cynical statements about the prospects of democracy as a system because it didn't work in these examples. Imagine if these examples were the only examples we ever had of democracy being tried in a human society. Then we would conclude, well, democracy doesn't work. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work. But given the right context, given the right cultural context and the right structure, it can work. And it's possible communism or some other form of collectivism that's not exactly akin to our current conception of global capitalism and democracy might work. And it might even work better than the system that we have now. And I think it's a bit hubristic on our part, on the West, to always assume that this is not true simply because as of right now, what we have is the best thing running. And so as of right now, nobody has overthrown this existing order, as if it's a truism that our type of society is the type of prosperous and successful society. It's the archetypical type. Well, it's sort of a recent phenomenon, though, isn't it? You know, we're talking about the last couple hundred years, really. Sort of a recent phenomenon throughout history. Empires and civilizations have been successful to varying degrees for varying lengths of time, much longer than what we've, some of them much longer than what we've just enjoyed right now over the past, let's say, if we're being generous, 500 years or so. Um, that's being really generous because democracy hasn't really flourished for 500 years, but this sort of Western order or whatever. Um, there's been a lot of civilizations and regimes that were monarchies, that were empires, that were essentially autocratic, and they flourished. So there's absolutely no imperative on democracy, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you know they were communist. So I know I started off talking about communism. We're just talking about systems here, like different systems. Like we can't assume just because right now democracy is in its heyday and Western civilization is in its heyday that this is the end all and be all of political structures. No, right now it happens to be on top. It remains to be seen what's going to happen in the future. And just to end it on a sort of almost sci-fi sounding note, because I noted that it is possible that communism might be something that is pragmatically or logistically not feasible for a human society to really flourish under. Imagine that because we see this different structure of intelligence in ants and bees, and I would argue that ants and bees are very intelligent life forms, actually, much more intelligent than we give them credit for, because you just have to look at the intelligence on the level of the colony rather than on the level of the individual. And because the colony shares its genes, there's almost an argument to be made that the colony is the real organism, and the ants are like cells in the organism. But either way, the what was I saying? Just pointing this out, like this fundamentally different conception of intelligence that exists in an ant colony, this collective intelligence that they're capable of doing without consciousness, capable of solving extremely complex problems, raises some interesting questions about artificial intelligence and what forms it might ultimately take. We take this sort of, I think, anthropomorphic, I can't remember, the one that favors humans. Like we personify the idea of artificial intelligence. We assume it might take some form of cognition similar to human beings. And we assume like consciousness is this higher level of intelligence that is necessary for intelligence, or it's a benchmark of intelligence. Maybe consciousness is a pragmatic necessity for our particular form of intelligence. And the successful AI that we end up creating never develops consciousness because it finds a more effective way of distributing its intelligence. And so, what does this have to do with communism? Well, let's say that we end up coming to compete with these artificial life systems. Let's say we come to compete with these robots, which some people envision might be or will be a pragmatic reality. Then we might be seeing some very different structures in regard to how power is allocated, and we might see this collectivism take resurge in a very, very dramatic way. So yeah, that's my best attempt. I'm at 20 minutes. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop it there. That's basically my thoughts on communism. I know I went a little bit in weird different directions, but other than to me, that's more interesting than just asking like this, uh, you know, trying to sort of was it resurrect Marx or resurrect Lenin or any of these people. No, their implementation clearly failed, but